Today, I want to talk about a concept that no matter where you're at in learning Blender, if you don't fully understand this concept, I think it's really important to know it. Now, this is a concept that you're going to run into when you're in your shading, when you're in geometry nodes, and many other tools in Blender. And that concept is understanding how black and white create movement, change, and so many other really interesting effects in Blender. And if you understand it, you're going to be able to control so many things and come up with really amazing animations. So today, I'm going to tell you all about this concept, and at the end, we're going to make a complete animation so you can walk away with something cool and really feel like you understand what we're doing here. So here's a question. Why, when I plug a noise texture into this plane, parts of it go up, parts of it go down, and why do they go as high and low as they do? Why is it that when I plug a random value into these spheres that some of them go to certain sizes, and why do they go to the sizes that they go to? And even if I understood that answer, how do I use that to make interesting animations? Now, this may sound like super basic stuff, but I promise there's some really cool things that you can do with it. Watching one video on a concept doesn't always solidify it in your brain. So if you end up liking this concept and think it's really cool and want some tutorials around this idea, I have a full collection of tutorials on my Patreon right now dedicated to this idea and a lot of other concepts that are kind of in the family of it that help you make really cool motion graphics. They're going to teach you some math stuff. They're going to teach you some attribute stuff, even some proximity and color and motion and looping. All of those things wrapped into a collection of really cool tutorials. If you want to check it out, that is going to be linked in the bio, and you can get 10% off if you subscribe annually. Now, at its very core, in Blender, the value 1 is also represented by white. They mean the same thing. And the number 0 is represented by black. Those two, they mean the same things. Now, most likely, the first place you've encountered this idea is with your principled bsdf node, where you can see as you move the slider, that value, that number is changing. So 0 would mean perfectly shiny, and white would mean super rough. So whenever we're looking at these black and white displacement maps or these roughness maps, they start to make a little bit more sense where I know if I'm looking at this roughness map, the darker portions are going to be shinier on the geometry and the lighter portions are going to be rough on the geometry, and you can play with it from that. But again, all this may seem very, very obvious and very basic knowledge, but what if we're using it in geometry nodes? It's a bit less obvious. So let's go back to that example I questioned in the beginning of this video when I plugged a random value into a bunch of spheres that are instanced on a plane. All right, let's look at this example. Also, funny enough, my black and white cat will be joining us for this explanation portion. Let's look at the scale of these spheres. Notice that it says 1 and we can go beneath 1, but they're starting here at 1, and this random value says max of 1, minimum of 0, and we'll plug that randomness right into the scale. Now what it's doing is it's giving each of those spheres a random number between 1 and 0. Now notice the bigger objects have a brighter color and the smaller objects have a darker color. And we can actually see the exact value that that color means. Notice 0.9 is very close to 1. It's a very bright color, and 0.1 is really dark and it's a small object. You may be more familiar with a noise texture. Noise textures, they look like this. I have all these cylinders and I want to randomly rotate them on their x-axis. And notice a value of 0 looks like this, and a value of 1 looks like that. So let's plug a noise texture, which is just black and white information, and plug that right into the x. You'll notice they all change, but they're all a little bit different from each other. So I want you to imagine a noise texture being projected across all of my cylinders here. And wherever a cylinder is located, there is a particular shade of gray that noise texture is creating and assigning that color to that object, and that corresponds to an amount of rotation. And again, you can see how those rotations correspond with different color values. And this is very similar to the random value, but in this case, if I scale down the texture, you can actually start to recognize that texture being spread across these objects. And with some simple math, you can actually take that effect that the texture is taking, exacerbate the rotation effect that the texture started, and really make some interesting stuff. So another example, if I take this smiley face image, you can see it's black and it's white. And we apply that to the spheres again, you can see, oh, well, the parts that were black no longer have spheres, and the white parts are showing the smiley face. So this is maybe like the most obvious representation of black, nothing, white shows the thing. Something that I have kind of recently gotten very addicted to recently. Maybe I'm making a selection that's scaling something. I can then throw that information into shading and then use that to line the material up with the movement, and you can get color, and it's super cool. So in the smiley face example, you can take that information, plug it into a store named attribute, grab that attribute in the shading, and now the smiley face is glowing on the instances, and we can make logos with instances. And that's just one really simple idea. But like I mentioned in the beginning, what do we do with this information? How can we take this concept of black and white, 1 and 0, and make creative animations with it? Well, let's learn how we can make this animation using this concept. All right, let's first model the objects that we're gonna be using in geometry nodes. So let's start out with a cube, head into edit mode, and just scale them to about this size. We're gonna give them a loop cut, and then we're gonna bring that loop cut right about here. Let's go to the edge select, grab an edge, and just bring it right about that angle there. I'm gonna hit Control A and apply scale, just in case there's any changes. Now, in the modifiers, let's go ahead and get a bevel modifier, and just get your settings to the way you like to see them for your scenes. Hit Shift D and duplicate this object 4 separate times. Now each one of these, rotate them on the Z by 90 degrees, Control A, and apply that rotation. The reason we want to do that is so that when we instance these in geometry nodes, they're not all going to face the same direction, and we get some really interesting looking variety. I'm going to hit these guys, hit M, and just title the collection whatever you want. I'm just going to call this guys, and we'll move it out of the way. Let's hit Shift A and get a plane, and this will be what we put our geometry nodes inside of, and we can hop into the geometry nodes workspace and get a new node tree. Let's go and search up a grid and put it into the group output. Let's scale it by 20 and give it 70 on the vertices. Now we need to instance those objects we created right up in here. So let's go ahead and get a instance on points node, and up here from the outliner, drag in your collection straight in. And to get this to work correctly, we'll need to click on separate children and reset children and plug it right into instance. Now, when we scale these guys down to fit, you'll notice they're all just kind of stacked on each other. Go ahead and click on pick instance. And in order to get them to be randomly distributed, we're going to get a random value node, switch it over to integer because we want a green diamond going into the greened instance index diamond. And we'll plug it right into instance index, and we will get a random distribution of all of our objects. I'm going to hit the tilde key, go to the top, and just go ahead and scale these guys to be right next to each other just like this. What you can also do is get a random value node, plug it into the scale, and then I'm going to bring them back to 0.12 on their scale, and then just scale a few of them to be higher to give it some random variation, just something very subtle. Now let's go ahead and create the animation that we're going to use that value information to get some really cool color and some really cool motion. Now let's go ahead and get a set position node. He's going to allow us to displace, but we only want to displace these guys on the Z axis. So we're going to get a combine XYZ node, plug him into the offset, and we're going to get a wave texture and plug that into the Z. And you'll already notice it is going to give us some really cool animation possibilities that we could just plug into our attribute node and get some color effects, but let's get this to look really cool. Let's switch this from bands to rings and from X to spherical, and then bring your scale down until you start to recognize a wave animation happening. So it's going to be on the really, really low values, something like 0.15, and you'll get an interesting looking animation like this. What you can do is go ahead and kind of exaggerate that by getting a color ramp or a map range, whatever you like to get. So I'm going to go ahead and get my color ramp. And if you bring it in, you can get a really interesting looking phase offset. Now, if you don't like the height, if you don't like the scale, first you can bring that texture scale down. But if you don't want them going that high, remember, black equals 0, black equal these objects that are kind of hitting the ground here on the ground, but also the white portions will represent how tall you want it to go. So if you wanted them to go even taller than this, you can get a map range and control that a little bit more. I find just getting them to be something around here looks more like a reasonable, really interesting animation that when we play with the phase offset, we get a really, really cool looking wave. We can even bring the scale to like 0.05 and get something really, really dramatic. Maybe 0.08 should give us something super, super cool. Now, like we talked about in this video, values of 1 and 0, black and white, we can send that to the shading to get really cool color effects, because we're already seeing how the values of black and white give us this really interesting wave animation, but how can we use that in the shader to really create something interesting and cool? The way we can do that is go ahead and get a store named attribute node, and I want it to specifically understand we want to affect the instances. So we'll choose instance, give this any name you want. I'm going to call this wave, and we'll plug the color of the wave straight into the value so that when we type in wave in the shader, this wave will get sent straight to the shading and we can use him in the shader. And that's really the reason I made this video in the first place, to show you how cool this is and how you can use this. Of course, we need to get a material set up. So we'll get a set material node right over here. We'll go ahead and just create a random material and grab it here. So we can head straight into shading and set some stuff up. So first, right here, we'll make it metallic. We'll make it a little bit darker so that when we add our materials, we add our lighting, it's not going to be super bright. Let's get a color ramp and we'll plug that into the roughness. We'll get a noise texture and we'll plug that into the color ramp. And if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, you can hit Control T and get a object coordinate. And because we're dealing with geometry nodes, I want you to notice something. If I scale up my noise texture, see that repeating pattern? We don't want that. So what you can do is, because we're using the object coordinate, you can just select this and it will treat it like one big object, which is exactly what we're looking for. So we can bring our detail up to 12. We can bring up our roughness a little bit, and let's crunch the black in, crunch the white in, and bring the black up a little bit so we don't have a bunch of shiny areas. We want a very rough, very grungy looking metallic material that will contrast with the glowing effects we're going to add next. So we're going to make something really interesting with our emission. So if we bring up our emission, we can see it just kind of spreading across the whole thing. This is when we can grab our attribute node. Again, because we told it to understand the instances, we're going to switch this from geometry to instancer, and then we'll type in the name of our instance. And if we just want to make sure it works, first we can just plug that straight into color, and we can see, okay, in the emission, that wave is totally mapping and working correctly, which is great. So I can just sever that connection really quick. I'm going to get a mix color, and let's add something interesting here. I'm doing this instead of getting a mixed shader node. This is a little bit, keeps everything into one principled. So we'll plug this right into the color. We'll plug our attribute along with a color ramp so that we can control that black and white value of the attribute just a little bit more. So we'll plug factor into the color ramp and plug color into the factor. Make color A black so that we can now see that color again. And then we're going to get a layer weight along with its own color ramp as well, so we can manipulate the layer weight if we need to as well. So we'll plug that right into B. So what's going to happen is we can kind of see this layer weight working. Let's go ahead and give it any color we want. I'm going to go with a blue, and then I'm going to bring up the strength. And so what the layer weight is going to do is help us kind of accentuate the corners of the instances within this scene, and then you can kind of exaggerate it a little bit on your color ramp as well, so we can get this really cool effect. So then When we head back to geometry nodes and look at the material preview, if we play with the phase offset, you can see that this is working. Of course, I think it's spreading out a little bit too much compared to the displacement. So I'll head back to shading and I'm gonna crunch in my wave texture a little bit. This attribute plugged into the color ramp, we can control it a little bit, just like this. So again, back to geometry nodes, we can see it's a really cool look. So now that we have this, we can light it and we can animate it. So let's create the loop. Because we are using the wave texture, I'm gonna bring that phase offset to 0 and I'm just gonna give myself 120 frames. I'm gonna go back to frame 0 and right on the phase offset, I'm gonna hit I, go to the very end, and I'm just gonna type in, I don't know, 4 asterisk pi. So that's gonna be 4 times pi, and I'm gonna hit I, and there we go. We have our animation. Of course, if you don't want it going inward, in my animation it was going outward, so we would just do -4 asterisk pi. And there we go. Now we have this looping over 120 frames. So now that we have this, we can go to the compositing. Let's turn on the glowing. So right here on our compositor, let's click on use nodes, add in a glare node, plug it here and just turn on bloom so that when we go back to layout, we can go here to the render view, we can turn on always and we can say, okay, it's glowing, and we can change that if it gets a little too intense. So I'm gonna switch over to cycles and let's go ahead and get our camera angle. So Shift A, search camera, I'm gonna go back to the flat view, Control Alt 0, snap it to view, and I'm gonna switch here in the camera settings to orthographic, and then we can just sort of scale it out to be something like this. So now we can see, all right, cool. This looks pretty great. We can see it in cycles, working perfectly. The glare is definitely too bright, so we can go here into the shading and we can turn on cycles. We can go to always and then just bring the strength of the glow a little bit lower. Okay, so now let's go ahead and get a light that's kind of hitting it this direction. So Shift A, light, area light. I'm gonna hit G and just kind of move him over here. And then hit R twice to point him right into the, right into the center. So I'm gonna maybe hit G and hit higher a little bit there. I'm gonna switch this over to a disk, scale it up. I'll go back to my camera view and then give it a power of maybe 1,000 and then bring that spread down to something like this and maybe bring that power to maybe 300. That might work. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna bring my world brightness down to black, scale up my light a little bit, and then we can give it a little bit of volume right over here with the principled volume, and then give your density like 0.01, 0.02, and then bring your brightness to maybe like 500. And then I'm noticing my glow is just completely gone. So here in the area light, make it a little bit blue. And then I'm gonna click on this guy here and go to my principled and bring my strength up a little bit until my glow is back. So there we go. Let's just go ahead and give this a test render. There we go. This is our final look. Looks super cool, looks super clean. I'm such a big fan of just this like very simple wave. It's almost kind of obvious, like use a wave texture, but really you can use any texture you want to create these color effects on your geometry nodes, and they all just line up perfectly, and it's really, really fun. So what we can do is just go ahead and say, all right, we're done. Go ahead and pick your render settings. I'm gonna do 1920 by 1080, and I'm gonna give myself really 400 on the samples just to make it look really nice. I encourage you to do a PNG sequence if you want to. If you want Blender to just export out a MP4, you can go from PNG to FFmpeg video, encoding to MP4 or QuickTime. I'm gonna use MP4, and then we're gonna do perceptually lossless render animation. And when you're done, you're gonna have something really cool like mine. So there you go. Hopefully, even if you've encountered this black and white 1-0 concept, it fully makes sense to you now. Again, if you want to learn way more examples of using this process with some really cool animations, check out my Patreon. I've been doing a lot of geometry nodes, motion graphics tutorials this year. Lots of really cool stuff on the Patreon. You can get 10% off if you subscribe annually. You can check that out, linked in the description. But with that being said, thank you for watching. I hope this was educational to you, and I will see you in the next one.